The Battle of Agincourt was fought on October 25th, 1415, St Crispin's Day, and was immortalised in Shakespeare's play Henry V. Although it's held as a great victory for the English army, outnumbered by great odds, the Battle of Agincourt is actually more a battle that the French lost than the English won. In this video, we're going to take a look at the setup just before the battle itself, and some rather interesting and curious episodes that happened during the battle as told by the chroniclers of the day. So, let's get stuck in, shall we? Under Henry V, the English, in part of the French campaign, had attacked and taken the town of Harfleur. But the English had taken quite a significant number of casualties and losses. On top of this, they had run out of food, and most of Henry's retreating army were suffering from dysentery, the scourge of medieval warfare. And so Henry was trying to make his way back to Calais in order to take his ferry home to England. The French nobility perceived a chance to cut Henry off on his move to Calais and to finish off the French army and maybe the 100 Years' War in one big blow. The French had amassed all of their nobles together and cut Henry off just outside the village of Agincourt. The battle essentially looked like it was going to be a foregone conclusion. The English, remember, suffering from dysentery, which must have been rather uncomfortable and weakening to the body, only numbered 6,000 troops. 5,000 of those were peasantry yeomen and archers, the longbowmen of the English, and only 1,000, maybe even only 900, were men-at-arms. The French, on the other hand, have somewhere between 12,000 to 30,000 troops at the fields of Agincourt. They have crossbowmen and archers, but they have a huge array of men-at-arms. So confident are they that they can just wipe out the English in hand-to-hand combat. The noble men-at-arms and mounted knights push to the front of the battle, leaving the crossbowmen and archers of the French at the back, unable to do anything to affect the battle. Just before we take up the actual battle itself, there are a couple of critical details we should take a look at regarding the fields themselves that the battle would be fought on, and some contributing factors to the benefit of the English and to the negative setup of the French. Not knowing that there was going to be a battle at Agincourt, the peasants about a week or so before had been out and about ploughing up every field with their oxen. Add to that there had been rain for 3 solid days before the battle. Every field was essentially a quagmire of churned up mud. This would make the French attack quite heavy going to come to the British line, something we'll see later. Also, something that the English did have was Henry V himself, this valiant warrior who seemed to be able to inspire the common man with his silver tongue and motivational speeches. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," as he would say in Shakespeare's play. On the other side, the French didn't have their king with them. Charles VI suffered from glass delusion, meaning that he thought he was made of glass and could smash if someone touched him. So clearly he wouldn't want to be on the field of battle. It wouldn't be very circumspect if you're made of glass. So he was wrapped up in cotton wool in Rouen somewhere. The command of the French army was supposedly under the command of the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, and Marshal Boucicaut. However, these men ranked in nobility lower than a number of the nobles on the field, and so with arrogance, these higher nobles thought, "We're not going to listen to you, we'll take our positions in the fight wherever we like, because there's so many of us, we're going to crush the English quite easily." And because of this, the nobles jostled for various positions on the field of battle, forming up 3 lines of men-at-arms, a chunk of cavalry at the front, and the crossbowmen and archers of the French got stuck behind. Henry positioned his men between 2 woods either side of the field, which made a sort of funnel shape to the field. Henry set up at the narrow end. He put archers to his left, archers to his right, and put all of the men-at-arms in a dense centre around himself. He had himself in the middle, The Duke of York, a 60-year-old and obese, we are told, character, took command of the right, and Lord Camoys took command of the left set of men-at-arms. All of the archers carried a 6-foot sharpened stake, which they put in the front of the ground, hammered in as a sort of cavalry repellent, so that the horses couldn't just charge through them. Now, at the other end of the field, Boucicaut and Albret were planning to have a cavalry charge which would outflank the archers, get around them, and once surrounding the English army, attacking with the men-at-arms at the front. But unfortunately, not all of the cavalry could be found. I don't know how you actually lose a load of cavalry, men dressed in plate armour and giant war horses. It makes you wonder whether there was a group of cavalry sat on the wrong field somewhere, wondering where everyone was. However it may have been, nothing happened. And not being in a rush anyway, since the English were out of food and they had dysentery, the French just waited. And so at 11 o'clock, Henry, realising something had to be done, ordered his men to take up their stakes and walk up the battlefield and re-establish a new position, which they did. And all this time, the French didn't attack them, they just watched them coming. So the archers re-established their fortified stakes, and now they were in what was affectionately called the killing zone, and began to pepper and confetti the French troops with hard-tipped arrows. Without any instruction, the French cavalry that were at the field, and there was still a significant amount of them, decided enough was enough and charged down the field in order to take out the archers. The problem being the ploughed field made the going quite heavy for the horses. Add to that you're being hit by 3,000 to 5,000 arrows every 20 seconds. It'd be like going helter-skelter through a hedge. And so the French cavalry probably didn't look up for fear that an arrow could go through the visor. Horses were being taken down, of course. And then they came to an abrupt halt as they crashed headlong into these sharpened 6-foot stakes, catapulting the first line of the cavalry into the archers, and the archers finished them off with mallets, hatchets, and a particularly effective tactic of sticking a dagger through the visor and through the eyes of their opponents. The rest of the horses in the cavalry charge, of course, were a bit fearful of the stakes and began to trot on the spot. All this time, the arrows of the English archers just wading into them. And so the French cavalry turned and fled back up the field, churning the mud even further as they went. Unfortunately for the French, the cavalry crashed into the oncoming first rank of men-at-arms. Marshal Boucicaut, seeing the cavalry run on their own accord, thought he better go and support them from behind, and now there was a great clash in the middle of the field, and the cavalry put the men-at-arms in disarray and charged all the way through the next 2 lines as well as they tried to escape. Regrouping themselves, the first rank of the French men-at-arms on foot began to walk down towards the English lines. And here is where the shape of the field comes into play, as well as something else that we're going to come to. The field was funnel-shaped. There were thousands of men in this front line. And as they moved down the field, they began to get squeezed tighter and tighter together. This would be multiplied by a factor of 10 probably because of the French idea of battle etiquette. You see, the French didn't believe that a nobleman should fight hand to hand with a peasant. And so those on the left and right had no intention of fighting with the archers. There's no money to be made there. The idea in war is not just to kill, but to capture nobles of the opposite team who you can sell for ransom. And so the men-at-arms to the left and right of the line turned their attention towards the centre of the English line where the nobility were, where their men-at-arms were massed together. Of course, this made the squeeze to the centre even more oppressive. And for the English looking on, it must have looked like the French men-at-arms were playing a game of extreme sardines. Again, remember, all the time the archers are pounding thousands of arrows into this sort of mass of men. So much so that the chroniclers say that the men-at-arms tipped their heads down as they trudged across the field, hoping that the arrows would just ping off their armour. This caused hundreds of them to trip over in the mud, where the plate metal and the aerated mud from the cavalry charge formed essentially an industrial strength adhesive, and the men who fell couldn't get back up. On top of this, thousands of men with their head down couldn't see what was going on and continued to trample all over their comrades in arms, so that many of them drowned before even getting to the English line. Eventually, though, they got there. But they were so tight pressed. Imagine the consternation if you were one of them when you're about to fight with the English and realise you can't even raise your arms, let alone swing your weapons. For a short while, the English basically had to walk up, lift up their visors and jab them in the eye. The slaughter of the first line was dreadful, and they couldn't organise themselves. Even when it began to thin out, they were so worn out and overheated in their armour that many in the first attack decided to turn and try and get out of there, slipping and stumbling as they went. Here again, another calamity hits the front line, because the second line of men-at-arms, thousands of them, had also come squeezing down the field, not wanting to miss out on the fight and capture some nobles to ransom. Remember, they were ignoring any battle strategy because they thought they outranked the Constable of France and Marshal Boucicaut. This second line tangled up with the front line, causing again a great deal of confusion. It was like games of Twister going on all over the battlefield. Eventually, the second line got to the English, and the fight really got going when they managed to make some space for themselves, and some of this space was actually quite ironically made by the English and French cooperating, taking up bodies of people and stacking them into piles so that they could get some space to fight. It's quite amusing to think of it, you know. Right, you get the feet, so I've got the arms. Okay, over here. Good job, mate. Right, where were we? It's in the second line that we find an interesting French character who seemed to get off to a good start in the battle. His name was Jean I, Duke of Alençon. We're told that he comes and attacks with the French on the right of Henry. And he meets the Duke of York, this 60-year-old veteran, whom he swats quite hard, and the Duke of York splats into the mud where he can't get up, and so is trampled to death. Although other chroniclers say that the Duke of York was smouldered to death. What's meant by this, it appears, is that the press was so tight that the Duke of York overheated in his armour and died from heat exhaustion, you know, like the radiator breaking inside. But that's not all. Having made one successful blow, some think it was the Duke of Alençon who turned his attention to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, none other than the king's younger brother. And most amusingly, we're told that Humphrey receives a blow to the crotch. Seeing his younger brother now down on his knees, cupping himself and gasping, Henry V runs forward, stands over his brother to stop the French from finishing him off. And here again, the Duke of Alençon appears and goes for his hat-trick when he swipes an ornament off Henry V's head. This ornament, of course, is not a carriage clock or a vase. It's a fleur-de-lis, which is on the crown which Henry had put around his helmet, showing his men that he was with them in battle. The whack that he must have received to take that ornament off must have left him seeing stars and ringing in his ears. He could well easily have been killed there had not his bodyguard charged the French as hard as they could to push them back. The Duke of Alençon was put in a difficult position and was about to surrender himself when we're informed that a Welshman in Henry's bodyguard called David Gam, who was cross-eyed, would you believe, kills the Duke of Alençon. David Gam then gets a wallop from somewhere out of left field, and before he dies on the battlefield, Henry stands over him and knights him, which was very obliging of the king. What makes the problem worse for the French is that Henry tells the archers when they finish firing to join in the battle, swarming around the edges of the French men-at-arms. They weren't expecting this, and being cloth-shoed, they could spring about in the mud much more easily than the metal plimsolls of the French. And of course, they're swatting away with their mallets and putting their daggers through visors. On top of this, they're taking away prisoners left, right and centre and stacking them up behind Henry's lines. The problem is the archers that are guarding the prisoners are beginning to get a tad worried that there's so many of them, by the thousands. And they fear that if these prisoners decide to try and escape and get their weapons back, the archers, there aren't enough of them guarding to stop that. And so when Henry hears that a local knight called Isambard of Agincourt has got around the back line at some distance and is pilfering the baggage train, Henry fears Isambard might release the prisoners behind him, and then the English would be, well, swamped from either side with absolute defeat a certainty. And so Henry gives an order which today is accused of being against the laws of war. And that was, he told the archers to start killing the prisoners who had surrendered. And they did, and there was mass bloodshed behind the English lines. Interestingly though, the chroniclers, even the French chroniclers, do not criticise Henry for this order. They understand the predicament he was stuck in. So what about the third line? Part of the third line of the French had advanced, but not all of it. Seeing the carnage in front of them, seeing this massive bloodshed going on behind the line where nobles were not going to be spared, it seems most of the third line decided, you know what, I'm not feeling it today, and they went home. No doubt thinking we really should have had a plan. Maybe putting the archers and crossbowmen at the front would have been worthwhile. Lying dead on the battlefield after the match was over, approximately 6,000 French were dead. Most of them nobility, a lot of them young nobility, so the flower of the French as it was called. By contrast, the English had lost only a tenth of that, even less. Between 400 and 600, it appears, died on the field of battle. Of course, when Henry returns home after this victory, he is met with, the cries of hero of the English realm. But there is a small footnote after the battle itself, which personally I find quite amusing and very telling about Henry himself. After the battle, they go to a nearby village, not Agincourt, where the king holds a meal for his nobles, and he gets those French nobles which were captured and weren't killed to serve his food to them. One of those captive was Charles d'Orléans, an actual prince of the blood. What really must have rankled in the French breast after being beaten up so tragically and terribly when they outnumbered the English was that Henry now decided to give them a lecture on morality and ethics. You see, the French, sometime before, had captured the town of Soissons, which was held by the English, and when they got in, they pillaged and massacred and raped and did all sorts of terrible things, pretty common for the day. Henry decided to tell them how wrong this was and that they were very naughty boys. And he demonstrated that this was a theological issue. You see, the patron saint of Soissons was none other than St. Crispin and St. Crispian. Agincourt was fought on St. Crispin's day. As Henry says in Shakespeare's Agincourt speech, "Today is St. Crispin's day." And so Henry says to the French, "Crispin was here at the battle and he crushed you because of your wickedness in Soissons." So if nothing else, the French got a lesson in medieval theology, and the British got a battle that they would remember down to this day. And that was the Battle of Agincourt, 25th of October, 1415.